Hello, I'm Dr. Esmacher, and today we're going to be talking about Tricky Dick himself. Yes, today we'll be talking about the presidency of Richard Milhouse Nixon as we leave the 1960s and enter the 1970s. So let's dive in. So, even though Nixon had run for president in 1960, narrowly losing to John F. Kennedy, he's going to have a more successful bid in 1968. In the election of 1968, Nixon runs as the Republican candidate against Lyndon Baines Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, as the Democratic nominee, and then a third party candidate, Southern Governor George Wallace, running as an independent. So Nixon structures his campaign around a group he dubs the silent majority. So he says these are everyday Americans who don't agree with the more radical direction of the 1960s, who want a return to law and order. Remember, 1968 is a very tumultuous year. It's the year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, of wave of riots that followed that assassination across inner cities, and the very chaotic Democratic National Convention, where again riots break out. So his campaign for a return to law and order does strike a chord with a lot of Americans. However, because of the presence of George Wallace, who's also appealing to this kind of reactionary turn against 1960s radicalism, that will siphon some votes away from Nixon. Nixon will win the popular vote by a slim margin of 43%, with George Wallace taking 13% of the popular vote on a platform that was largely built as a reaction against the civil rights movement. This is one of the first times since the Civil War that Southern states go for the Republican Party. If you look at the Electoral College map in 1968, Wallace does win a good portion of the Deep South, so states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Arkansas. However, Nixon does well in the Upper South, so Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, not West Virginia. West Virginia went Democrat. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. So part of this is due to what we call the Southern strategy. The Republican Party knew there was a lot of discontent within the Democratic Party over Johnson's presidential administration supporting civil rights and pushing things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which inserted the federal government into things like civil rights administration and voter registration that many Southern states reacted very strongly against. And so there was this sense that now these Southern Democrats who felt that the national government had gone too far on enforcing civil rights might be in play for others in the party. You can see this by the fact that the only state that classifies as traditionally Southern that goes Democrat in the 1968 election is Texas. Okay, the rest of the Southern states either go to Nixon or Wallace. So Richard Nixon, again, running on a campaign in which he argues the 60s have been too radical, that we need to return to law and order, is elected, and he will serve not quite 2 full terms as president. We'll talk later today about what happens in that second term. But even though Nixon ran on this belief that society was going too radical, that we did need to go into a conservative direction, how conservative really was Richard Nixon? On social issues, he was very often mixed. A lot of his social policies, as we'll talk about, especially with the issue of welfare, are very much more progressive than the mainstream Republican Party at the time, and in fact did mirror his Democratic predecessors like Johnson and Kennedy. When it came to foreign policy, however, he does hew a little bit more conservative, but at the same time does see the benefit, as did the previous Republican president before him, Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose vice president he was. he did see the wisdom in de-escalating the Cold War, especially working throughout his presidency to establish more peaceful relationships with the Soviet Union and China. Nixon felt that the Cold War was a strength for the Republican Party. He tends to focus a little bit more on foreign policy. That's his preferred time in office. And in many cases, he does that because that's the area of agreement that he has within his own party. When you look at domestic politics, he has a very mixed track record. He does end up expanding the welfare state. We're going to talk about his reforms in the issue of the welfare programs in a second. In many ways, he does, much like Eisenhower legitimized the New Deal, Nixon's support of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, or at least some of them, do also serve to legitimize them, give them a nonpartisan air, and in some cases, he does expand some of Johnson's earlier Great Society programs. So let's talk a little bit about what the federal government looks like under Nixon. For one thing, Nixon's presidency marks a number of new federal agencies created. So again, the growth of the federal government. For example, Nixon will be president who oversees the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which is established to regulate pollution and the environment. There's also establishments of both OSHA and NTSB. So OSHA is Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The NTSB is the National Transportation Safety Board, and these are prompted by concerns over workplace and consumer safety. So, for example, Ralph Nader, who's probably more familiar to some of you for his work as a consumer advocate and his publication of a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, which exposed safety issues in auto manufacturing, that's going to prompt a concern for oversight. So this is why a lot of cars prior to the 1970s, for example, don't have seatbelts as required or mandated, because this just really wasn't a concern until the 1970s, this idea of consumer safety on a large scale. The early 1970s is going to be when the United States enacts much of the environmental legislation that exists today, in part because of the environmentalism movement. The environmentalism movement in the 60s and 70s can be dated back to the publication in 1962 of a book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was a biologist who noted in her book the impact of common pesticides, for example, DDT, on wildlife, and how these things that were being marketed to consumers, for example, you can see DDT being advertised to housewives is a great way to kind of, keep pests out of your cupboards, that they were harmful to biological organisms, that they were doing more harm than good. And this led to, in this case, her book led to DDT being banned as a pesticide and a substance due to its negative effects on wildlife and people. But there's also concern over other pesticides, in particular pollution, air pollution. Los Angeles, because of the embrace of highways and the automobile and their particular topography, Los Angeles had a phenomenon called smog. So this is basically polluted fog. And in Los Angeles, the air quality, because of this pollution, was so bad that in the early 1970s, breathing air was the equivalent to smoking several cigarette packs a day. So there's this, again, concern over public health and safety being caused by pollution of the environment. And this prompted Congress to act and to pass a series of laws. For example, the Endangered Species Act, passed in 1973, will work to try to conserve animal species that are seen as in danger of extinction. The Clean Air Act, passed in 1970, and the Water Pollution Control Act and Pesticides Control Act, both passed in 1972, will work to try to eliminate pollutants in the environment. In particular, the Clean Air Act worked to reduce the 6 major airborne pollutants, and it worked really well. Within the first 10 years of the Clean Air Act, these airborne pollutants declined by 1/3. And in particular, lead, which was a common pollutant due to its presence in gasoline, which is why you buy unleaded gasoline today, lead declined in the atmosphere by 95% within 10 years of the Clean Air Act. At this point in time, environmentalism was seen as a bipartisan movement. This was not something associated with leftist politicians or Democrats. Again, this is something that is being pursued by both sides of the aisle in Congress, and they're identifying, in this case, pollution and issues impacting the environment as an issue of public health and public safety. So, hence the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency to try to regulate pollution and try to clean up areas of the environment.